And so as this time that we live in, family is held in low regard. There are many countries now where they don't consider the fact that you should even have to be married, that marriage is an outdated institution in a lot of countries, that raising a family is outdated. If you do not believe me, go ahead and read. In Europe, many countries now no longer have children. They're facing a crisis because people are deciding not to have children. Why? It's a burden. And so less and less people in those countries are having children. So we're also in a time where we're redefining what family is. That's happening before us. Other things is the gap has closed between married households and single households. So we see this gap closing. It's interesting, as I had worked in years past with international students coming to live in host families, inevitably they want to live in two-parent homes. I said, that's great, but that's not the reality of all our home situations in America any longer. You know, we do have a lot of single-parent homes. And so that's one of the things that some other cultures haven't dealt with yet, as we have here in America. But let's be honest, not every two-parent household is a healthy household, is it? Some single-parent households are much healthier than two-parent households. Some two-parent households consider family time everyone sitting around doing their own thing and never talking or engaging one another. That's considered family time. There's also some homes today where parents pass everything they are to do off to other people. Here's what I mean. As a principal of a Christian school, I would interview families to come to our school. And you got the idea with some of those families, hey, I'm going to drop my kids off, and in 13 years, I'm going to pick them up, and you're going to have them ready in every aspect of life, okay? And I'm going to pay you to do it, so we should be good. Okay, that's the reality what some people think. Some people think when it comes to church, I'm going to bring my kids every Sunday morning, and maybe on Wednesday nights if we don't have anything that interferes with that, and you're going to teach my kids exactly what the Bible says and what to do. And so parents inevitably take all the authority away from themselves and put it on other people. Why? Because then if things don't turn out, they're not to blame. I have a friend that works in a local daycare here in Hagerstown, Maryland, who has told me before that there are children the age of 2 or even 3 dropped off at 6:30 in the morning. The parents go to work, get off of work, go to the gym, will go out to eat, and show up at 6:30 that night when it's time to close to pick their child up, take them home and put them to bed. Parent of the Year award right there. So they're giving everyone the opportunity to raise their kid when kids just want their parents to be the ones involved, the ones doing it. So we can't just assume because 2 parents are in a house that it's necessarily a healthy home. The other thing is, when it comes to this, 20% or 1/5 of all moms are now under the age of 18 in America. Let that one sink in for a second. So 20% of our mothers in America are now teenagers. And out of that, 1/6 of them will never get married. So single moms, families are changing. The dynamics of what we consider family is different. Okay, gone are the days of the old TV shows. Just get that out of your mind. That's just not there. It's totally different. The landscape has changed. On top of that, unmarried homes now make up majority of homes in America. And there was a recent survey done, and I want you to really hear this because we talked about other places. 40% of Americans now consider marriage as obsolete. There's no reason to get married. You don't have to get married. You don't have to take your vows. You don't have to do those things. And so, that's something marriage we can talk about another day. But today we want to talk about the impact of the next generation and the decisions we're making in regards to our families on this next generation of young people growing up. And so as we think about this, I want you to get this today is this. Our church, and I'm talking about the church as a whole, not just FCF, our church is not immune to what is happening in this world. We're not immune to this. The church has to get out of their mind that, all the stuff that happens in society, all these views are only people outside of the church. That's not the case. There are many people in the church today that hold these same views. So there's really not a difference between a lot of people in church and a lot of people outside of church. The only difference is we come here on Sunday mornings. So we can't think that this does not impact where we are today. As a matter of fact, consider this. All right, I made a list of families in the Bible. I want you to just hear this before we go any further. Here we go. Consider some of the families of the Bible. Adam and Eve had a son who killed his brother. Abraham lied about who his wife was. Sarah allowed Abraham to be intimate with her servant. Isaac at one point lied about Rebekah being his sister. Isaac and Rebekah struggled with favoritism between their sons, which led to deceit and trickery. Jacob was promised to have Rachel as a wife, but instead was given Leah. Eventually, Rachel's father did allow Jacob to marry her, but she could bear no children, so he ended up having children with Leah and multiple servants before having a child with Rachel. That does not come on at 2 o'clock on CBS. That's really in the Bible. All right, number 7. Jacob showed favoritism to one son that led the brothers to form a plan to have him sold as a slave. And then ultimately, Joseph became the most powerful man in the land, second most powerful man in the land of Egypt. And when there was a famine, his brothers returned, and he gave forgiveness to them. Now, that's the book of Genesis. We don't have time to go through the rest of the families in the Bible. That's just Genesis, and there's a lot more in there, trust me, that we could have listed. So when we see this, we see in the Bible, we look at our society today, families are messy. Family life is messy. But here's what I want you to consider is this. If the church is not immune to this, if we see people in the Bible dealing with this, there's 3 things I want you to get from this. Number 1 is this. There are people in our church today, FCF, and I'm not saying I'm a prophet, I'm just telling you, I know people. There are people sitting here now or who will be sitting here later who are contemplating divorce right now. There are people who either both spouses are talking about it or one's thinking about it. Because we just know what society is, where it's at. It's happening. There is someone here today probably thinking about that or going through the motions to have it happen. The second thing in regards to this is someone in here today is most likely hiding a deep, dark sin that no one in their family knows about. Sometimes we have sins in our lives that we don't want other people to know about, and we cover it up, and we keep covering it up, and we hide it. And even the person that we say is our best friend in life, the person that we love the most, our spouse, we don't even share it with them. And that sin will ultimately destroy multiple lives because someone is unwilling to deal with it. I know someone who personally was in ministry who, I'd gone to school with them. They wanted to be in ministry, and they kept the sin hidden, and eventually it was exposed, and it almost ruined their whole family. So we have to be willing to deal with sin in an appropriate way. And then the third thing is this. There is either a family here today or that is facing a major crisis, or there is a family sitting here today that will face a major crisis, probably in the next year of your life. That's the reality. And maybe that crisis is a result of a decision you make or a result of a decision that someone else makes, and you happen to be on the receiving end of it, but someone will face that. It comes back to the fact is family life is difficult. It's messy. There are things that happen. But here's the great part as we're going to look at this today is we're going to see that there's a major need for us to step up and that we can do that. Now, when it comes to this, I want you to remember like the video games we used to play growing up. Some of you still play video games, me included. But some of you never played video games, so you just go with the flow on this. I know it's like some people probably played with an abacus, and that was exciting. But here's what it is. So here's what it is. There's younger kids in here like, abacus, what is that? It was the first calculator. So anyways, here's what happens. So, you're going through, you're playing a video game, and you're like, yeah, and you're jumping everywhere, and everything's happening, and all of a sudden you fall in the hole. And there's that song, dun, 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 and the death music, and I lost a life. Here's the great thing. You get extra lives, or you get to reset it and start over again, right? That's not the case when it comes to family sometimes, and we're going to look at that today. So I don't want you to sit here and beat yourself up today and say, oh my goodness, we have messed up, we're completely down, we can't do this. No, here's the great thing. There may not be a reset button, but you can restart from where you're at. And so that's what we want to look at today. And so as we're talking about this, here's some things you need to realize as we get into this family discussion today. Number 1 is this. Sin is real. Sin is a real thing. And your family is facing sin and temptation. Consider what it says here. I'll read for you Ephesians 6:11. It says this, stand firm against the schemes of the devil, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the powers, the world forces of darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. So in your families, it's not your spouse against you. It's not you against your child. It's not this generation against that generation. We face a true enemy in Satan, who wants nothing more than to destroy families. to tear families down. And I'm sure we could all sit around and tell stories, maybe some personal or others that we know of, families that have been rocked because of decisions that have been made. So sin is real. The second thing you have to remember is this. No family is ever immune. No family is untouchable. Sometimes we think if I put all the parameters in place, nothing can touch us. Okay, well, you're in trouble if you think that. And so here's what I mean by that. There was a family I knew years ago, and I preached a sermon in February, and it was on passion for purity. The parents were giving promise rings to their kids and, making those vows. So afterwards, you ever have one of those conversations where you can tell someone's coming for you and they really want to bite your head off? Yeah, see, some of you are like, yeah, I've had that. Okay, here I am, young kid out of college, just felt like, I nailed it. Like, yeah, we got the church encouraged, the family's encouraged, and here comes those people. And you're like, man, if they just had a spear and a shield, I'm going down. It's because there's no one behind me. I know who they're coming for. And I never forget, this dad put his finger in my face and said, I never knew we were having an X-rated sermon today. I'm like, I didn't either. Where did it happen at? And he said, you preach an X-rated sermon. I said, all I did was say what the Bible said about biblical purity and what we need to do. How was that X-rated? Song of Solomon, I get it. But anyways, he said, we keep our kids from that stuff. I'm like, here we go. I said, all right, well, let me ask you some questions, if that's okay. He said, sure. Now, at this point, there's part of me that I want to teach and, show them the Bible. There's part of me, I have pride and I want to knock you down because you just put your finger in my face. So I can't say my motives were pure in this. But anyways, I said, let me ask you this question. Do you allow your kids to watch TV? Oh, no, we do not. We do not have cable. We do not have any TV stations. We only buy movies that we preview that we feel are appropriate and let our kids watch them. All right, so I lost that one. Okay, so music. Do you let your kids listen to music? Oh, no. Only the songs and CDs that we purchase and we tell them it is okay to listen to. Okay, 2 for you, none for me. I'm losing this one badly. Let me ask you a question. You homeschool your kids, correct? Yes. Do you go to co-ops with other homeschool parents? Yes. Do you think every single parent raises their kid the way you raise your kid? Probably not. Your kids already know everything I've talked about. Well, how would you say such a thing? Because kids talk. Well, I would disagree with that. I'm like, I would doubt that. A couple years later, I found out his kids knew. And so sometimes we think we can set up every parameter, every safety precaution. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any, but we think that's enough. That our family could never be touched by something because we put all these defenses up. And the reality is that's not always the case, which leads to this. Number 3, assuming that all parents parent the same way you do. Now, here's what I mean by that. Let's say like that family I talked about, you got family A over here who doesn't have TV, doesn't have music, doesn't have whatever. They put all the parameters up just like that family I talked about. Okay, they're not Amish, they just make the. Then you have over here family B. Family B says, you know what? We're going to let our kids have some things, whatever you want to say, video games, music, movies, go to the mall, go to a roller skating rink, bowling alley, whatever it is. I only say that because some of us grew up in church where you didn't do those things because they played bad music. But you have this family who's kind of a little more free how they do things. This family looks at that family and says, they're just weird. Kids, they're weird. All right? They're just weird. This family over here looks at that family and says, oh my gosh, they're of the devil. We need to pray for them, kids. We need to make sure that God saves them, that he will do something in their life. And then here's what happens. It's like the teacher orientation night. Now, I don't know about you, but you go back to school night, I sit there with my kids and I watch all the other kids. I know my kids. I don't need to watch them. I mean, I don't let them run free, but they're sitting there. Some of you are like, well, that's great parenting skills. Why are you talking about family today? So anyways, you watch the other kids and you're like, mental note. Okay, that one. So all right, kids, you see how the teacher's talking and that kid's misbehaving right now? They're going to do that all year. Don't hang out with them because they're going to mislead you, right? Oh, see that kid, what they do? That's bad. Don't do that. Don't hang out with that kid. And that's what we do. And inevitably, we do the same thing in church. We have this family and that family, and we tell our kids to stay away from each other because of the way the kids act. Here's the thing that I've come to the realization of. Kids just do what they're supposed to do because they're sinners. But yet sometimes we blame parenting or lack of parenting on the kid, and we isolate them or we cast them aside. And I've seen it done in churches before. And the reality is, if you think everyone parents the same as you, that's a dangerous thought and it's naive. They don't. There's people that probably wouldn't agree with how I parent my kids. That's okay. I probably don't like how you parent your kids. But the reality is, we still need to encourage and pray for one another and not isolate one another because of that. And so don't assume everyone's doing what you're doing. Don't assume your way is the best way. So we have to be careful with that. And we come to this passage then of Joshua 24. And it's kind of, I want to say this before we move on, because I think this will drive it home. Working in schools, and some of you work in schools, you have those kids who just kind of get under your skin and can irritate you or whatever. And they drive you nuts. Okay, well, as a teacher, that's what happens. I had the opportunity to become a principal. And I'm not saying this with, this is just a few isolated incidents. But you knew the kid, and you get to know the parents a little bit. You ever heard that saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree? I can tell you in reality, there were some apples that drove me crazy. But then I met the tree. And I felt bad for the apple. And so, you have to be careful sometimes to holding kids to an expectation that they don't even know that they have. They're just doing what is natural. Just like family situations, they're a product of what's happening in their family. And so we have to remember that as we work with the next generation. So as we get here, we have to realize this next generation of young people is in desperate need of adults who will pour into their lives both in their homes and outside of their homes. Desperate need. And you're going to see how we wrap all this together. But as we get to Joshua 24 and read it today, we're going to break it down into several parts. And I want you to really hear what they're going through. And it's not much different than what we're facing today. Just a different thing as far as how Joshua says it to them. But very close to what we're facing today as families. So we come to Joshua 24, and we're going to take it in sections. And I want you to really hear what Joshua is saying here to the people. So the first thing is this, and we're going to start in verse 1. It says, Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem. And he called for the elders of Israel and for their heads and their judges and their officers, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham, who is the father of Nahor, and they served what? Other gods. Keep that in the back of your mind. Other gods. Then it says in verse 3, then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and multiplied his descendants and gave him Isaac. To Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau I gave Mount Seir to possess it, and Jacob and his sons then went down to Egypt. I then sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt by what I did in its midst, and afterward I brought you out. I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea, and Egypt pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. But when they cried out to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and he brought the sea upon them and covered them, and your own eyes saw what I did in Egypt. And you lived in the wilderness for a long time. Then I brought you into the land of the Amorites, who live beyond the Jordan, and they fought with you, and I gave them into your hand. And then I took possession of their land, and I destroyed them before you. Then Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose and fought against Israel, and he sent and summoned Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. But I was not willing to listen to Balaam, so he had to bless you, and I delivered you from his hand. You crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho, and the citizens of Jericho fought against you. The Amorite, the Perizzite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Girgashite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Thus I gave them all into your hand. Then I sent the hornet before you, and it drove out the 2 kings of the Amorites from before you, but not by your sword or your bow. Then listen to this. Verse 13, I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities which you had not built. And you have lived in them, and you are eating of the vineyards and olive groves, which you did not plant. What he's doing here is this. The first thing is he's reminding them of where they came from. Where they came from. What's interesting is, who does he call to the point? Who's he talking to here when you look in verse 1? Who are the people that are called first that he talks to? All the leaders, guys, men. Why? Women didn't hold those positions in that time. So he's calling the elders, the heads, the judges, the officials, all forward, all the men to come forward and hear this. So you know what it tells me here? Who had the responsibility when it came to their families? Men. So as men, we have to be careful that we're not giving up the authority we have in our home. That doesn't mean we lord over our homes, but men are responsible for what takes place. There are studies done that show that dads dictate what happens to the health and well-being of their children. Dads, there's a lot on us. That's scary, but it's a huge responsibility that we have. And so he's calling the men together, and this is what he's saying. Remember everything that's happened. Where does he do it at? He does it at Shechem. Now, why is Shechem so important? In Genesis chapter 12, it says Shechem is the place where Abraham was promised that the people would go into the land, and Abraham built the altar there. So he's bringing the people back to the point where it all started, and he's saying, look, here's what you were promised. Right here, at this point, is where the promise was made, that you would have this. And then he goes through this huge list, this litany of everything that God had done. He delivered you. He brought you out. He spared you. He delivered your enemies into your hand. But what was the problem the whole time? Remember what I told you? Remember what were they doing? Serving who? False gods. So despite everything God was doing, despite all the deliverance that God was doing in your life, you still look to these false gods. You did none of this. You are not here today because of any of your own efforts. You are here today because God did it. As a matter of fact, in verse 13, he almost kind of gives them a backhanded slap and says this: despite everything that God has done, you had done, God delivered you, protected you, and has blessed you. And as a result, you are standing here today because of what God did. So even though you've turned your back on God at times, God still gave you something that you're not worthy to receive. So here's where you came from. Here's what you've done. This is what your life has been defined by. And then he continues on and says this, verses 14 and down. Therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt. Notice he says that again. Put away those gods. For it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord. Choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The people answered and said, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For the Lord our God is he who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, and who did these great signs in our sight, and preserved us through all the way in which we went, and among all the peoples through whose midst we passed. The Lord drove out from before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. We also serve the Lord, for he is our God. Now, he reminds them where they came from. Now he says, let me remind you of where you are. And what he says is this. He says, fear the Lord and serve him, in verse 14. And here's where you have to understand really what he's saying here. The first thing is fear. Fear means you respect, you revere someone, you respect them. So he's saying, respect who God is. Respect the fact of whose God's name is and what he has done. But then he says this, serve them. Well, the word serve here means to put yourself in bondage or slavery to. So in other words, he's saying, look, put yourself in slavery to God. In other words, the idea here is you can only serve one thing. And what he's saying is you're either going to serve these gods or you're going to serve the God. But the reality is you can't do both. And he's saying you have to do that. Now, let's just take a break here for a second and think about it. How does this apply to us today? Because I don't think a lot of us are running around worshiping false gods in the sense of what they were doing. But it is true in some of the things that we're doing in our families today, or some of the things we're permitting to happen in our families today. Meaning this, how about social immorality? Have we come to accept some things as socially okay that we before did not see as okay? Are some of our families open to some of those things? Has the media portrayed some of those things in a way? Now, I'm not saying go home and throw your TVs out today, but look how much our TV shows have changed in the last 20 years. What was on 20 years ago versus what was on today. You know, last night I sat down and I introduced my kids to a TV show I loved as a kid. And I was like, this is different. And so we watched a couple episodes of Alf. So it's, and the kids are like, we got to buy all the seasons. I'm like, yes. So, but you know, it was cool as we laughed, but kids were disciplined. There was structure in families. You know, there was accountability for what you did. Turn the TV on today and see if that happens in most things. It doesn't. And don't believe for a moment that media doesn't affect our families. It does. And so socially things that, you know, that were wrong are now acceptable. Even people who used to think that way, that things were wrong. You know, and we can go all over the board with this, but, you know, obviously I was having this conversation with someone several weeks ago, and I said, we started talking about, you know, our landscape of our family situations and the institution of marriage in America. And I said, you know, I'm not for people of the same gender getting married. And they said, that's ridiculous. Why would you not do that? I said, well, here's why. And I went, obviously, what the Bible said and what I believe how God instituted marriage. But then I said, if you're going to say that's okay, would you deny someone this over here, and I'm not going to get into details, that they may choose to marry something else? And he goes, why do you have to be completely ridiculous with what you're saying? I said, here's why. Because once you go down a slippery slope and you start permitting everything, where do you stop? And I said, as a matter of fact, 15 years ago, you said this was disgusting and should never happen. And now you embrace it with open arms. Your slippery slope has already started. So you can't deny one person and tell this person it's okay according to what your worldview is. You can't do that. Because now you play God. And you become the standard of morality. And we had this whole discussion about it. And, you know, so people what used to think was not okay now say it's okay. How about, you know, when it comes to sexual immorality? You know, the internet has opened up a whole world of different things as far as immorality and what can happen. Sexual immorality is almost glorified in our society. You know, people may cheat. People may have, you know, sex before marriage or whatever. It's become the norm. So that's some of the things that happen. How about judgment with no love? We've become a very judgmental society. We know we become the standard of what's right and wrong. You know, we have an expectation for everyone else, but we don't have the same expectation for ourselves. Even in the church that happens. How about when it comes to greed? Have a lot of families become you know, the point where they're greedy. They become ruled by the plastic in their lives. They just buy more. They go more places and just constantly run debt up at the cost of their family because they want more, or even pride. You know, how about those of us who, you know, force our kids or push our kids to the extent because it's all about how we look? If you don't believe me, it's not true. I invite you to come out to any youth sports organization in the local area and just sit in the stands and observe. You know, I've shared stories before from when I've coached, what I've witnessed parents do to their kids. So all these things, and there's many more, are things that are happening today in our families. These are the common things that we serve, you know, ideas or money or, you know, philosophies or whatever it may be, we begin to serve these things. And the thing is, if we're serving those things and we're more entitled to what the world has to say, then I guarantee you we're going to turn our backs on God. Because what he's saying here is, look, people, you can only serve one thing. You can only serve one person. You can't do both. And so that's what we're looking at. And he says, how does this happen? The first thing is he says it happens with sincerity. To be sincere, this word here, sincerity, means without blemish. You're all in. There's not even a question of what's happening in your life. So it's above reproach. So in other words, when he says, look, serving the gods, there's no question who you serve. It's either the world or God. You're either all in or not. Not 1 foot over this line, 1 foot over the line. You're all in. And the second thing he says is to do it with truth. Truth here means a firmness of faith. I believe what I believe and I follow it. You're not wishy-washy. What our kids, the next generation, doesn't need is a bunch of wishy-washy people. You know, maybe some of us are products of wishy-washy theology, which exists today. There's actually a great report I read this week that came out that this lady who works at Princeton and is a Christian, she did a study, and it shows that the growing religion and why people are leaving the church, young people, is because everything's self-esteem, feeling good. So why do I need God? I can do that on my own. And this is because we don't want to offend people. We want people to feel good about themselves. And we've talked about that. Younger people are walking away from it because they're like, why even go? There's no purpose in that. I can do that on my own. So this is where we're at. And as we come down to it, he says this: what are the results if you put away your false gods? He says there's two false gods. There's the false gods of where you came from and the false gods that you inherited when you came into this land. Put them aside. In other words, get rid of them, completely be changed. An idea of change is transformation here. See, here's where you came from, here's where you are. The two should not look the same. If you are someone today who professes to know Christ, who follows God, your life should not look the same now as it did before Christ. If it does, there's a major disconnect happening there. Transformation has not taken place. If I would still talk the way I talked before I knew Christ, before I fully followed Christ, I would not sound like a Christian. You know, if I did some of the things I used to do, I would not show Christ to other people. But the problem is today is we're still trying to accept Christ, but hold on to the things of our past. Paul makes this clear in Ephesians chapter 4 and 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that the old should pass away and behold, a new person should be born. A new person should be started. You should look different. It's that idea of transformation. You know, if you've ever watched a transformation of a butterfly, I mean, let's think. How many times do you ever pick a caterpillar and go, you were going to be the most beautiful thing in the world. I cannot wait to see you, and you pet the, right? Some of you are like, they are disgusting. But you'll be the first person to sit and take a picture of a butterfly because it's so beautiful. And you know, and I think of times I've been in Costa Rica, and you look at caterpillars, and then down there they have butterflies everywhere, and you can buy them like, people actually pin them up, and you can buy them in shadow boxes. But you look at them for sale, and you think, man, they're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. But it started with this ugly caterpillar. I mean, maybe caterpillar's your favorite, I don't know, but they're ugly. But anyways, but you look at it, how does God take something so ordinary and change it into something so extraordinary? That's transformation. How does God take a decrepit, depraved sinner? That's the condition of what we are. It's not feel-good theology. That's what you are according to Romans. So this is who we are. He takes it, he uses us, he comes in our lives, he changes us, and then we become a beautiful person, part of his family. That's transformation. And so if you're sitting there holding on to your false things, your gods, your idols, whatever it is, and you're trying to follow God, that's where the struggle is happening. You can't do both. And here's the other thing. It comes down to the choice. And go back to verse 15, because this is probably the one verse that a lot of you hang up in your houses. You have them in nice frames. You know, you buy those, whatever they're called, stencils, and you put them on your wall, and it says, for me and my house will serve the Lord. Okay, but we have to get really what that means. And this is what he says. If it is disagreeable to you to serve the Lord, then you have a choice for today whom you will serve. These gods or the true Lord. And then Joshua makes a statement that has forever been etched in the walls of our homes and churches. For me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I'm not serving any of those false gods from the time of when Terah and Abraham. I'm not serving any of the gods of the land we're in now. We are serving the one true God. Who is? Me and my house. Who's responsible for this? I am. My house is going to choose to serve God because I choose to serve God. Get that? He's talking to the gentleman here. Guys, now ladies, you can't tune this out. But he's saying, look guys, I made this choice. You need to make this choice. It's either those gods or the one true God. But you can only choose one. And so many times we believe we're following God and we're leading our family when really we're not. We're going down a slippery slope or a false pretense of really living out Christ. But here's the other thing. How can we set an expectation, a realistic expectation for our kids or the next generation to follow Christ wholeheartedly if we don't? Why is it as parents, as older generations, we want to hold our students, our kids more accountable than something we're willing to hold ourselves to? Why is that? And so it comes down and he gives a warning and a rebuke here. But basically, notice what he says, Joshua, to the people. In verse 19, you will not be able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God, a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, and he will turn and do harm and consume you after he has done good to you. In other words, look, I don't care what you people tell me. Your actions don't match your lip service. God's not going to honor you just because you say it. And that's the thing. In the church today, duplicity has become a very prominent thing. I will say what I think people want to hear, but I will do something entirely different because we think that's what people want to hear. And then inevitably, we teach our kids how to do the same thing. But then we get mad when they do it to us. But that's the expectation we've created in how they do things. Well, I can say the right things. And we believe sometimes just because they say the right things, they're doing the right thing. And we know that's not true in our own lives. And so he says this. The people say in verse 21, no, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua then said, you are my witnesses against yourselves and what you have chosen for yourselves in the Lord to serve him. And they said, we are the witnesses. He says in verse 23, therefore put away the foreign gods, once again, that are in your midst. So they haven't gotten rid of them yet. And incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. Give your hearts, not your lips, not your thoughts, give your hearts. The well-being, the center point of who you are, give your hearts to God. And the people said, we will serve the Lord our God and we will obey his voice. So Joshua in verse 25 made a covenant with the people that day and made for them a statute and ordinance in Shechem. An altar, a memorial to what had been done, was established in these families and these people. Here's what we'll do. And so he reminds them, he says, incline your hearts, give your hearts to God. And so as we think through this today, how does this apply to us? Let's just talk about this for a few seconds. First of all, if you're a young person sitting out there today, don't think I lectured your parents for the last half hour or whatever and you're off the hook. For younger generations that are out there today, there's some great things. We have to, number one, be willing to listen to the older generations. Listening in Proverbs 1:8, it says, listen to your father. Do not forsake the teaching of your mother. But that requires that your parents teach you what is right. But you're supposed to do that. And then I know there's that popular verse that we love to tell our kids in Ephesians chapter 6, right? Obey your parents and honor them, right? Obey and honor. You know what's interesting is when you look at that verse, obey and honor, it's something we quote a lot. But what does it really mean? Obey means to listen and follow. So obedience is equated to our love for someone. Just as our love for God, we will obey his commands and follow him. When we love our parents, we will obey and follow them. And the reason for that is out of honor. That word honor there means something that's basically priceless. So young people today, hold your parents in a priceless position. There is no price you can put on who they are. But parents, that means if we're asking that of our kids, we have to give something to them that is priceless. We can't just say we want it. We have to give something for them to want to obtain that is that. As a parent today, we have to be growing in our own life and imparting stuff to our children. Because we want to quote Ephesians 6, 1-3, we can't ever forget what 4 says. Ephesians 6:4 says that we're supposed to what? Bring up our children in the instruction of the Lord. That word bring is an amazing word. That word bring literally means we are to nourish and bring our kids to maturity. So in other words, it's a process. It's not just giving little quips of wisdom. It's not just saying verses. It's literally investing in the lives of our kids. It doesn't mean we just come home and say, I am a parent. It means you come home and you are a parent. You do what a parent does. You teach your kids. Take those moments and talk. Whether it's at night, you sit and read the Bible and teach them. Whether it's a life situation they're going through and you work them through it, bring them up into maturity. It's a process. And if you're sitting here today and you fall in the category of no longer a little child, no longer a parent, empty nest or whatever, you're not off the hook. You still have the opportunity to impact the next generation. Titus 2:2-3 says that the older men and likewise the older women are supposed to set an example for the younger. That word example means that you leave your mark or impression upon something. So the question becomes then is, and the older would constitute all of us who are not kids, younger kids, how are we leaving our mark and impression on the next generation, whether in our home or outside of our home? Because, see, kids get all kinds of teaching today, all kinds of things that come their way. But there's only one thing that can impact and change their life forever. And just as Joshua stood up and told these men that eventually to tell their families, you got to get rid of all this crud in your life, all this false pretense, all this false worship, and follow the one true God. Same thing today is dads, parents, we have to get rid of everything. Older generations, we have to get rid of it. We can't just keep trying to teeter on both sides. We either choose God or we choose the world, but we can't do both anymore. And some of you are doing a really good job with that. Don't feel like we're here lecturing you today, but there's some of us, let's be honest, there's a line, and we just go like this. Sundays we're here, rest of the week we're here. Sundays we're here. Oh, I'm going to stay here on Wednesday, and next week I'm back here. We do that. We have different lives outside of it. And so as we're talking about this idea of stepping up, here's where we're at and what we want to talk today about when it comes to generations and the challenge to you all as a church. There are some great things happening in our generations ministry, meaning kids and students. We have needs. But here's what I want you to hear is this is not a plea up here for warm bodies. Would you ever send your kid to a doctor who does not have a license or a degree to be a doctor? Of course not. But yet in churches, every single Sunday, every single week, we find people who breathe and who have a pulse, and we put them in rooms with kids. And we call them workers. Now, I'm not saying here at FCF, we do a pretty good job of screening and training our workers. But if we're not willing to commit medical malpractice with our kids, why do we do spiritual malpractice? And so we want to be above in what we do here. And so we're looking for people who get it. It's not about just filling a seat. It's not about just sitting down in a chair, coloring some pages, and running kids to the bathroom and getting them some goldfish. Okay? It's not about that. It's about discipling and investing in the next generation, being a voice. And you're going to see shortly why that's so important when it comes to kids' faith. And so we have great ministries on Sunday mornings. This fall, we're starting Kids Life, which is going to be a time where kids have games, crafts, worship, lessons on their level. Eventually, the goal is we're going to put our older elementary students into small groups where they'll have a small group mentor. Maybe that's something you want to do. Why? Because as a church, as you heard last week, we believe community and connection is vital to the health of someone's spiritual life. And so we want to start teaching our kids that. As regards our student ministry, at any point we can have 120 students walk through our doors and call this their church. That's how many students we have on our mailing list that come at any given time. Not at all one time. But I'm one person. I can't reach 120. So I have to depend on other adults who can invest in the lives of our students. And so we are looking to establish adult mentors who will be willing to come in and, just like with the kids, work with students. Now, I know students are scary. They dress different. They listen to different music. They wear their hair different. Remember, your parents thought you were different too as a teenager, even though the stuff that you listen to, a teenager would never be caught dead listening to today. But here's the thing. They need people who can invest in their lives. And so we have these needs of people. Now, there are some kids who come from homes that are doing a phenomenal job of teaching them and discipling them. We have kids that show up and students who show up. This is it. This is all they get. And so we need people who can invest. You know, I stand before you today not because of anything else other than the fact of people who filled a void in my life that was needed, men who stepped in and set a role for me, who showed me what to be a man of God and all that. And so I know the importance of having mentors in your life and what they can do. People who took their time. People didn't have kids who took their time and spent time with me. It's important. So kids need that. Students need that. And here's why. There are some great things happening as far as our kids and what's going on, even our student ministry. And I'll just give you a snippet real quick. This past summer, we went to Boston. Ever since I've been here, one of the things I've said is I want to see a student ministry that's not just about fun and games. We do those things. But a student ministry where students are cared for and care for one another, students who lead their friends to the Lord and then disciple their friends. I believe that will set our student ministry apart because 95% of student ministries don't do that. I'm just giving you the realization. And so I said, that's what I believe. That's why I'm called to do this. And so this is something I've told our teens. I said, I want to empower, train students, and work myself out of a job that I become a facilitator, not the one doing everything. So we're sitting here in Boston, and I walk up to one of our student leaders and just start having a conversation. And I said, you know, God's really put some things in my heart. I just want to see what you think about it. Now, there's something you have to learn. When you talk to students and they start laughing or smiling, there's usually two reasons. Number one, because what you said's pretty neat and they think it's cool. Or number two, you're just a dweeb. And they're laughing at you, not with you. So it was one of those times where I know I don't try to dress or act like them, so I knew it wasn't that. And the student said, Pastor Brian, it's so cool that you're saying this because a couple of us got together and have been praying, and we said we need to do this. You know, Pastor Brian has always told us this is what needs to happen. We need to take ownership of this and do this. Now, as a student pastor, you get excited because you're like, yes, they're getting it, all right? So we sit down to leaders and we talk one night, and we're discussing this. What will this look like in our student ministry when we get back, and how do we start making these things happen? Well, then I gave a challenge to all our students. Friday night, I want you to tell me, what do you want to see happen in our student ministry as a result of this past week? Well, the student leaders figure we're going to speak up and we're going to share, and then everyone will follow our lead. I asked that question before any student leaders could speak. 5 other students spoke up and said the exact same thing all of us have been saying. We're finally at a point where our students get what they need to do, but they can't do it by themselves. We need adults who are willing to come alongside and say, hey, I'd be willing to give time and invest. And there's some adults in here who do it, and they'll tell you it's a blast. There are some really neat students in our student ministry. So we need that. So here's why. You have this in your bulletin today. This is not a pressure. I do not do this. But like most people, you take your bulletin, you glance, and you throw it out. The last 3 weeks, you saw last week with the campus, the life tracks, the small groups. You're seeing this week with generations, and then Pastor Dave's going to bring it all together next week. We're serious about what we're doing, what we're called to do here. We believe a lot of you are as well. Pray over how you could be used, and don't think you can't be used. Because like I said, there was people who've poured into my life who didn't have kids. I was not their child, and they poured into me. Don't sell yourself short. Our youth staff is so eclectic that every time I interviewed all of them, they're like, well, I had this in my past and this in my... And what's been amazing is God has used their past to talk to certain students in our student ministry. So don't ever sell yourself short that you don't have something to offer them. You remember what it was like to be a teenager. You remember what it was like to be a kid. The world's a weird place. It's even weirder today. But, now we just can tell everyone what's weird in 140 characters. So, this is what's happening. Here's why. We're establishing a multi-generational discipleship ministry. And here's what we're doing by that. Just as Titus said, the older set an example for the younger. What my vision and what I'm starting to do is this. The adults come down and mentor the students. The students, in turn, the student leaders, are going to go mentor elementary kids and work with them. And then we're even starting, believe it or not, in our Faith Kids Worship Ministry starting next week, actually starts today. Today is Promotion Sunday. Starting today, older students are being trained in leadership and ministry to work with younger kids in our Faith Kids ministry. And what we're creating is this intergenerational discipleship peer-to-peer ministry model that we're going to use to reach the next generation. Why? Because then it becomes a cycle. So as the kids in a small group in elementary school, they just naturally come into one to junior high, senior high, then adults. Then adults start mentoring, and it just becomes a filter that keeps cycling. Because we believe in the importance of this, and here's why. There was a study that was done, and it's going to be up here for you. There are 4 things they said, and I've shared this briefly with you before. 4 things that would cause a kid's faith to stick almost 100% of the time if these 4 things happen. And I took our whole youth staff through this study. The first thing is this, is that a student needs to attend church or a student ministry on a regular basis. They have to be here. So don't come to me if you have kids 10 years from now and you don't invest in church and make church a priority and say, I've lost my kids, what should I do? Okay, remember, there's not a restart button, a reset button. You start now. Not 10 years from now if they make a decision, you start now. It doesn't mean that they could still walk away. That could happen, I'll be real with you, but the likelihood's less. The second thing they say is this. A young person has to be involved in intergenerational worship, this type of setting. They have to be involved with other adults, other generations. The third thing is this. Notice why we said this. They have to have a small group, a mentor in their life. So why is older people impacting them so important? It's one of the sticky points when it comes to their faith. So we need people who are willing to mentor, to work with them. And you're like, well, I don't have the whole Bible memorized. Neither do I. None of us do. It's taking what you know and living it out. That's what's real to them. They're not looking for theology. They're looking for real Christianity. And the fourth thing is this: participate in ministry. Kids who go and do ministry, generations who keep doing ministry, it sticks. So when older kids work with younger kids, that usually is a sticky point. And so they followed 500 youth groups, and this is what they found. These four things pretty much were consistent in kids' lives who did not walk away from their faith. And so in order for these things to happen, in order for our generation ministry to happen, we need adults, first of all, who can step in and help. But we also, as parents, need to step up our game in our homes as well. Because we can't just depend on people here at church. It starts at home. Even if kids get it all here, if we don't set the bar high at home, they'll meet that bar usually. So it's pivotal what starts in our homes, but it continues here at our church because we are discipling a generation of impressionable minds and hearts to follow Christ. Let's pray.